What's up, Wargamers? Welcome to World of Wargaming. It's that time again where I would like to invite you to pull up a comfy chair, grab a tasty beverage and a delicious snack, and let me talk at you for a minute. Today, I'd like to talk at you about the Silver Bayonet. Now, this game has been out for a little while, and I bought this book as soon as it came out. But it took me a long time to get the models together and get them painted and to thoroughly read through the book and then play a few games. I've managed to get in a few games before talking to you guys about this, and gals, and whoever else may be listening. But this is, technically, at the time of recording this would be Joseph McCullough's second most recent game. Joseph McCullough is also the author of such games as Stargrave, Frostgrave, Rangers of Shadow Deep, Oathmark. Lots of good content. His most recent game was the small kind of micro game that he released in the Volume 4 of Blaster. But this is the last full book game release that he did with Osprey Games, who Osprey brings us tons of good stuff. And this one is, the system is a lot of fun, and overall I love the setting of this. Silver Bayonet is, as it says on the cover, a war paint. No, that's not how you say that. A war game of Napoleonic Gothic horror. So you are a unit of soldiers in one of the major powers of the Napoleonic War, and you're a specialist unit who has been selected to fight and combat the supernatural in the war. So in this world, as the Napoleonic Wars are going on, it's so much death and so much carnage and so much pain and so much suffering that it unleashes these creatures called the Harvest Men. And the Harvest Men feed off of all that raw negative emotion and then use that power and that energy to spawn mythical and fey types of creatures. Things like werewolves, vampires, and trolls, and goblins, and hobgoblins, and it's this wonderful mishmash of these two very, very contrasting settings. Now, this is not, I have recently seen other games with a similar theme to them, such as Carnival from TT Combat, which I will be talking about on the channel at some point in another video. But it's also a world it's a little bit further back. It's 1795, where this is, I think, a little bit later than that. But yeah, you are selected and formed into these units. The name, the Silver Bayonet, is the name of what that unit is called in England, or in the UK, in the British Empire. It doesn't really give any information about what the units are called in other countries. And you're put together from whatever your old job was, and your job is now to hunt, fight monsters, deal with the supernatural. And this is the background. It's only a couple of paragraphs of background information, and then it goes straight into what you're going to need. So the game plays in 28mm, and it uses, on the one side, Napoleonic models, which you can get from tons of places. Perry, Warlord. I got one of the units, also North Star military figures, makes actual Silver Bayonet units. So I bought one of those. I bought the Russian ones because they have a werebear, and I mean, duh, right? But any old 28mm Napoleonics that you have will work for the game. The model side, the monster side, 3D printing WizKids. The WizKids pre-prime models are a winner. I've bought and painted a lot of those for Rangers of Shadow Deep, and they are, for the most part, a pleasure to paint. Every once in a while you'll get one that paint doesn't want to stick to right, and you do actually have to put some primer on it. But those Reaper Bones, all those kind of third-party ones, the models are very, very cheap and affordable, especially if you only need a single model. And they're fun to paint. It's different. It's just something else different that you can have in the collection and on the shelf. And those of us with the habit that we have and share, if you watch this, I assume we share a similar addiction. Or else why would we be here, watching other people talk about it. So 28mm scale, gameplays on a 2.5 foot or a 3x3, 2.5 by 2.5 or a 3x3. Now, it doesn't say anything in here about it, but I would assume that you could probably pretty easily scale this down to 10 or 15mm or whatever you want. I've never played it that way. I've never played any of the games scaled down that way, but I've seen lots of other people do it, like in the Facebook group and stuff. So I imagine it's, if you don't know how to do it and you want to learn how to do it, I assume that it wouldn't be that hard to find that information. If, for whatever reason, you happen to already have the Napoleonic stuff in that scale. I know a lot of times you'll see Napoleonic games and ACW games and stuff like that that are in that smaller 6, 10, 15mm scale. So if you have those, you could tweak, a few things in here, and I'm sure you could make that work. Other things that you'll need to play the game, if you are familiar with Mr. McCullough's games, you will be familiar with. You need clue markers. You need a deck of cards. You need D10s in this game. Now, I've never played Stargrave or Frostgrave, and I've never really watched anything about them, so I'm not exactly sure what those dice systems are. I do know for a fact that Rangers of Shadowdeep, which I played a lot of, and if you'd like to see me play some of that, check out a link in one of those corners to the playlist. It uses a D20 versus a D20 system. This system is much less swingy, which is good because like other of Joe's games, especially Frostgrave and Stargrave, which are also skirmish games, this is meant to be played predominantly as an adversarial game that also happens to have an AI doing stuff in it. It does, however, come in the book with 4 solo missions, which is where I'm going to start with filming, recording, playing the game, is with those 4 solo missions. And then as I can get people over to play games, we'll play games and do that as well. You'll also need fatigue tokens for this game, which can be any old thing, just be consistent. I use a little yellow plastic counter that I have from just a large set of things that were being thrown away from my job. And I was like, well, I can make use of that. So I did. Now, of those D10s, there are 3 distinct types of D10s. There are skill dice, which are meant to be red, power dice, which are meant to be blue, and monster dice, which are meant to be black. Now, again, those are the colors that it recommends here. If you don't have those colors, as long as you are clear and consistent with yourself and your opponent about what's what, use whatever you want, whatever you've got. Obviously, this is just, I take that more as a recommendation for how to do it. But as long as you and your opponent are clear and concise and upfront and understand what you're looking at on the dice rolls, everything is good, because those dice, the skill and the power dice, are how you determine your damage and how well you hit, which we'll get to talking about in a minute. The next section of the book I'm not going to talk about here. There will be a separate video, which will eventually, I'll put a link in one of those corners too, for creating your unit and outfitting your soldiers and everything else. I'm not looking to get into that here in just a general overview of the rules in the book. But if you played any other of Joe's games, it's a fairly similar system. If you've never played one of them, it is not difficult to do. He walks you through it very, very, very well in a very clear step-by-step manner. Whenever I start a new game, I like to do it because sometimes you have doubts, and not to say that you should just blindly trust some random person on the internet, but I do my best to try to understand it and make sure I do it right before I try to show other people how to do it. But mistakes do happen. But all that aside, it's a very simple process that I will talk about later. Next up in the sections would be the soldier list, all the different units, and there are a wide range of them. Some of them are tied specifically to certain nations, some of them are not. And one of the things that I've seen a lot of looking through the Facebook group that I think is really, really cool is people creating units for the game that are very, very themed. Like a friend of mine made an all-marine unit, and he's got like a boat and stuff for a display for me. It's super freaking cool. I think he has his unit set somewhere in Louisiana, which is another thing that I think is very cool about the game, is creating units based off of colonies. Like if playing the Americans as British, or playing Just earlier today, I saw a unit that was a Mexican unit, and it was using the Spanish rules. And I think that's really, really cool. Anytime you have that kind of agency and that kind of openness, even if it is within the realms, because it's a weird history game, you know, it's not like you have to adhere to any kind of like, you can't have rivet counters in a fantasy. Well, I guess I take that back because 40k players. But you shouldn't have rivet counting in a fantasy world. So you've got a lot of agency there to do what you want with it, how you want. Next up, we're going to get into the actual turn order, checks, all that good stuff. So anytime the game asks you to make a check, you're rolling your 2 d10s. You're rolling your red dice and your blue dice, or whatever colors you have. You only ever need those 2 dice, and then a few, maybe 5 extra dice, I think, that go into the fate pool, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But you roll those numbers, you add it together, you try to hit your target number. On the entries, you have some modifiers. So if you played, again, any of Joe's other games, if you haven't, I'll talk to you about it for a second. So you have speed, which is pretty much always 6. I think there may be some that are slower, maybe some that are a little bit faster. But I think base movement is 6. +1 melee, so you roll your dice, add +1. +2 accuracy for shooting. Your defense, which is what your opponent's target number. That's what they need to roll to be able to hit you. And you apply your modifiers and determine whether or not you were successful or an abject failure. The turn order for the game has 5 phases. It goes initiative phase, where you and your opponent will make a check, and whoever wins will have the initiative. They'll be the active player 1 for that round. Now, if you roll double 1s on the 2d10s, something very, very bad can happen. If you roll double 10s, something potentially very good can happen. There's a chart that you get to roll on to determine what good or bad or nothing happens. After the initiative phase, the primary player will activate half of their team rounded down to a minimum of 1. So if you had 7, you would activate 3. If you had 4, or if you had 6, you would activate 3. If you had 4, you would activate 2, etc., etc., etc. After that, you have the monster phase, where any monsters on the board will perform their AI actions. You have the secondary player phase. Now, in the secondary player phase, that player will activate all of their models, everything they have. And then you have the primary player phase 2, where the primary player will finish activating whatever models they have remaining on the board that have not activated. So when you activate one of your models, you can move and do another thing. Now, there are some things that you can, such as reloading, that you can replace your movement action with a reload. But for the most part, you can move or not move and do one other thing. The common things are shoot, reload, investigate. It does not matter if you move before or after taking the other action. Facing doesn't matter in the game. You can see, move, whatever, full 360 around you. There's none of that applies here. After your movement, though, there is another special action. You can sprint. So with that, you make a check at 11. Yep, target number 11. If you are 11 or higher, you can move an extra 4 inches. If you are 11 or lower, you can move an extra 2 inches. So you get a little bit winded, you get a little bit tired. Obstructions, difficult ground, that stuff will affect your movement, cut your movement in half. The standard type of thing. There is a forced to attack situation here, where if you are within an inch of an opposing figure, that other figure will automatically move into you and force an attack and stop your movement. It's there to keep you from being able to sneak around the AI through, like, if the AI is meant to be guarding like a narrow space. But the same with enemy figures in this game as well. After that forced attack, that closing the gap, the active model will then swing and attack as if they had just made a move to attack, which is like a charge action in the game. If you have 2 fatigue tokens, you cannot force the attack. And every time you are in a melee, you get a fatigue token. Also, I'm going to back up for a second because I had the reloading rule wrong. It's if you don't move, you can reload without spending an action. So you would still have 2 actions, although I'm not entirely sure. Maybe you could investigate and shoot. if you had moved yourself into a clue marker or something like that. Maybe that would be a situation where that would be good. But either way, if you don't move, you can reload for free. You can jump a distance equal to up to half your speed. And if you fall, you have to make a speed check at target number 12. Or you fall off the closest point and can take some damage. You roll a power dice and you suffer damage equal to the roll of the power dice. So 1 to 10 damage. Clue markers in this game can be investigated as an action, or you can replace your move action to investigate. And there cannot be any enemies within an inch of it when you try to investigate it. Bringing us to what happens when that move to attack or when that force to attack goes down. So in Melee in the game, you roll your 2 dice, your power dice and your skill dice, and you're looking to have a roll that is equal to or greater than their defense. Once you determine that you've managed to hit your opponent, it's time to see how much damage you did. Now, depending on the weapon you are using, it will use either the skill dice or the power dice for the damage. You take that number, so let's say it's a weapon that uses the skill dice, and you rolled a 7 on the skill dice, you are dealing 7 damage. Now, if they have armor, that will increase their defense, make them harder to hit. If they have damage reduction, that will deduct from the amount of damage that you do. And then certain weapons, if they do have armor, will ignore that armor, such as most firearms. Because when it says armor, I think for the most part it's talking about like some kind of metal breastplate, and we can shoot through that. After that hit is scored, the opponent has the opportunity to strike back or to back off. If they choose to strike back, they immediately make a melee attack, go through the same thing. If the new target survives the attack, it must back off. It cannot swing back at them again. You can't just go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That also means that you can't just get tar pitted in with something. Something's got to back off, with the exception of that being monsters, because some of the monsters will say that they don't back off. They don't do it. Bringing us to those fatigue tokens that we mentioned earlier. So as soon as melee combat is over, soon as it ends, and this includes the strike back. So if you're the player who's striking back, you do that before you get the fatigue token. The fatigue token means that, and for each fatigue token that a model has, it receives a -1 penalty to defense and to melee stats. You can never have more than 2 fatigue tokens. Fatigue tokens are removed at the end of the round, and if you are within 2 inches of an enemy, the active figure may spend their action to give that enemy a fatigue token as like a distract, like a, look at me, I'm in the bushes kind of thing, and then immediately end their activation. Shooting works in a very similar way, but because there is return fire. Yeah, so shooting works in pretty much the same way, except there are some modifiers. If you've moved already, you get a -1 to your shot. If the target is in cover, and this game is pretty generous with cover. It actually says it in the book, be very, like, even if a toe is in, you get the benefit of cover because your model would obviously be jumping behind that to dodge these balls of lead that are shooting across the battlefield. And if the shooting figure is mounted on a horse, it is -2 to your shot. After you shoot at them, if they have a loaded weapon, they can return fire and shoot at you. Shooting doesn't give you a fatigue token. Scratch that. If they don't want to shoot at you, then they can dive for cover. You can only return fire if you have a loaded weapon, which I mentioned. And if you are diving for cover, you may move 2 inches in any direction as long as it doesn't take it closer to an enemy unit that is within 6 inches and line of sight. And finally, you get in that situation where you've been shot at, you can also choose to do nothing. Now, at the end of all that, there are some optional rules in here that I believe firmly in playing because they are critical hit and critical fail rules. They are optional. You don't have to use them, but I think you should, because as bad as having a crit fail feels, having a critical success always feels really, really, really good. And why would you deprive yourself of that? Why? Why would you do that? Regardless of, with a critical success, regardless of whether it is melee or shooting, your opponent cannot respond to it. If it's a melee attack, they cannot strike back and must back off. If it is a shooting attack, they cannot return fire, and they cannot dive for cover. They just stand there in awe of your amazing marksmanship. Now, on the flip side of that, if you roll snake eyes on your D10s, a critical failure happens. And in that, if it's a melee, you lose your weapon. It's just gone. If it's a shooting attack, your weapon is broken. It just doesn't work anymore. In addition to that, you cannot use dice from the fate pool, which I know we haven't talked about yet, but you can't use those to modify that roll at all, which is a bummer. If you just manage to, if probability is going to get you that day, it's going to get you, but it's going to make for an interesting game, as well as an interesting narrative for that, like the story that the unit tells about the day Joe Bob lost his freaking sword. You know, it builds character and narrative within the game, and this is meant to be played narratively. It's meant to be, you know, linked games where you build your unit over time, and I'm here for that. The game does have cavalry in it. I don't know. You're really fast, and you can fight on your horse, and you can fight at things that are on foot. You can't investigate clue markers, though. Now, you can get off your horse, but if you do, you can't get back on your horse. And you're also not very good at shooting when you're on your horse, because you just weren't trained properly in how to shoot from horseback. But there are no shooting attacks against a cavalry figure. You don't get a penalty for... So earlier I may have said that wrong. It's if you are cavalry, then you have a -2 to shoot. So if you want to just make like a beat stick and put him on a horse, that could be good. They get +1 to melee and +1 to damage and +1 to defense. Both of those things, however, only apply to other non-cavalry models. So that's something to consider there. Now, even though these soldiers are battle-hardened and trained to fight the terrors of the night, sometimes you just lose your nerve. And there are times in the game where you will be called upon to make a terror check. Now, unlike normal checks, they are not presented with a target number. They are presented with just a modifier, so either plus or minus X. When you make a terror check, you roll your skill and power dice, add your courage modifier, and then subtract or add the terror check modifier, and then you compare it to the chart down here. And potentially you can get away unscathed. Potentially you could just absolutely collapse and lay on the table, and then at the end of the game during post-game you have to roll on the madness chart. So bad things can potentially happen. However, when those bad things do happen, you do have a very limited resource that can be used for it. You have what is called the fate pool. At the very beginning of the game, you set aside 2 power dice, 2 skill dice, and 1 monster dice. Now that count is different when you play a solo game. We'll talk about that when we get to the solo section. And the fate pool can be used for a couple of things. It can be used for rerolls. It can be used to negate damage. It can be used for a quick reload. And it can be... or as monster dice, which is what the monster dice you have in there is for. You must decide to use from the fate pool immediately after a given roll. So you can't roll and then see what your opponent rolls and then decide to re-roll, I guess. If it's, well, no, because it's not a contested roll. So yeah, you have to decide right then. You can't roll other stuff and do other things. You got to decide right then if you're going to re-roll it. If it is a situation where both players want to use a dice from their fate pool, the primary player has the priority there. So they decide what to do with the fate dice first. If the primary player does something to modify the monster's action, the secondary player cannot then do anything else to modify that monster's action. So rerolls are pretty explanatory. You got to stick with the new roll even if it's worse, and you can never use more than 1 fate die per reroll. When you negate damage, if you roll a 10, all the damage is negated. Otherwise, you divide by 2 and round up, and that's how much damage is negated. With a quick reload, it can be a skill or a power die from the fate pool, and it allows you to reload your weapon without spending action. So you could move, quick reload, and then still shoot in the same turn. Or the opposite order if you wanted to do it that way. With the rerolls, you have to use, like if you want to re-roll your skill dice, obviously you have to use a skill dice from the fate pool, and the same with the power dice, etc., etc. Now, the monster dice, there are a few things you can do there. You can use a monster dice to re-roll the skill or power dice for when a monster makes a check, but you only keep the new result if it is higher. You can't use it to try to make the monster do worse. You can use it to change the way the monster will behave. You can use it to change the target of a shooting attack to another legal target. You can spend it to have the monster move towards a different figure that's in line of sight. And you can also use it to move towards a clue marker or to a different clue marker, but only if there are no soldiers in line of sight for that one. And then we've got our monster actions, our AI. I love Joe's AIs. I think they're all very, very, very smooth and elegant, and I really appreciate that about his games. So here's the AI. Question number 1. Does the monster have an unloaded projectile weapon? If yes, it will reload the weapon and using its move action and proceed to question 2. If no, proceed to question 2. Question 2. Does the monster have a loaded projectile weapon and a soldier in range and line of sight? If yes, it will make a shooting attack against the closest soldier and then reload if it hasn't moved. No, proceed to question 3. Is there a soldier within line of sight of the monster? If yes, it will move its full speed directly towards the closest soldier in line of sight. If it brings it into contact with the figure, treat it as a move to attack and roll a melee check for the monster. If no, the monster will make one move action towards the closest clue marker. If there are no clue markers, it will move towards the closest soldier, even if the soldier is not in line of sight. Monsters also get some reactions where players get their dive for cover or return fire or strike back or back off. Monsters also have some reactions. If they're the target of a shooting attack, it will always choose to return fire if it has a loaded gun. If it does not, it will remain where it is. They will not dive for cover. If it survives a melee attack, it will always choose to strike back. So there's pretty much only 2 ways that a game of the Silver Bayonet ends. Either one side achieves the mission-specific objectives, or one side is completely wiped out and annihilated and is no longer on the table. You can always leave the board optionally if you want to preserve members so you're not taking injury, because again, the game is meant to be played with a build over time of the unit, so you can always make a tactical withdrawal to prevent injuries and things like that. But those are the 2 ways the game ends. You complete the scenario objective, or everybody else is gone everybody else from the other team left. The campaign and post-game system is very, very similar to other campaign systems that Joe has used, but if you're not familiar with it, well, let's talk about it. That's why we're here. We're here for me to talk at you about this game, the Silver Bayonet. First step is check for your injury, death, and madness. If you had anybody die, or say something has to make a madness roll, or any of those things, now is when you do it. Next, you calculate your experience. Next, you can do some research. Then you can reorganize and re-equip. And then you can calculate your new unit power ranking, which is helpful for playing games against other opponents so that you know about where each other stands power-wise. So with your injury and death, that is if you were reduced to 0 health points, you got to make an injury or death roll. You could be fine, you could lose a foot, you could lose an eye, you could just die. I mean, it's the Napoleonic Wars field medicine was not great. The only way you take a madness check is if you got the collapse result from the terror check table. If you have any power or skill dice left in your fate pool, you can use those to re-roll your fate rolls, your injury and death rolls, or your madness rolls, which I like. It gives me an incentive to maybe bank one, or to, it gives you another strategic option, because then if you're planning the withdrawal and you want to just try to get off the board, salvage everybody that you can, and then save those dice in case you have a bad roll, especially if you're later on into a campaign or a unit and you get attached. You get attached to these characters. You spin off all these little backstories and narratives and things for them in your head, dialogue and how their personalities and how they interact with each other. And it's just, it hurts a little bit to lose them. Like, that's kind of a little bit of the downside to games like this for me these days. Is sometimes sometimes they don't matter. Like, you just met them, whatever. Thanks for helping out. I don't know what to tell you. But sometimes it's somebody who's been with you since the beginning, and you're like double-digit games in, and it's just like, man, it's gone, dude. It's gone. Dice gods weren't with us. Moving to experience. So everybody who survives gets 1, and then you distribute bonus, which your bonus XP is determined by the scenario that you are playing. And then you have an experience tier table. Experience comes pretty slow in this game. It's not big leaps forward. It's just kind of a slow, steady climb. And as you reach certain XP totals, you'll unlock things. For example, at total 5, you get +1 courage. At total 200, tier 9, God tier, you get 1 courage, 1 health, or 1 new attribute or recruitment +5. So you could potentially have a pretty long running campaign of this, which I like. I'm here for that. Research is a feature the recovery of information or artifacts as their primary goal. Some scenarios do. Some of these will be relevant within the scenarios, but a few are important to the greater war effort or to future games. In such cases, a unit will need to research the articles they've recovered, and the scenario will state exactly how to go about doing this and what can be done with the information or artifact. So if you need to research something, the book will tell you to do so. And then I would assume you would go get another book. Reorganize, re-equip's pretty self-explanatory. After a scenario, if somebody died, you can replace them. You can swap out, maybe not your gear, but you can refill anything that you had that may have been single use or anything like that, or anything that you lost. If you lost your weapon due to a roll, you get a new one. Then you calculate your unit power rank, which is done by totaling up the tiers that have been achieved by all the fighters in the unit. All units start out having 0 tiers and begin with a power rank of 0. So imagine that. And the table in the book goes to 200. That's a lot of tiers and XP and stuff. That's pretty awesome. It also gives you an optional rule, which I think is a good rule that should just be used, especially if you're playing a campaign game with a group of people or with just a single person. And it's a differential. It's a handicap. So depending on the point difference or the tier difference, the power level difference, they get extra fate dice or they get extra bonus experience points for dealing with you. Which I think is good because I think that's a good way to potentially help the campaign from snowballing too bad. Because that is a problem if one person can jump ahead really fast, really quick. But in this, the XP creep seems to be pretty slow. So I haven't gotten to play into a campaign yet, so that's coming. But I think the way this is built, it's going to help negate a lot of the snowballing that can happen in these types of campaign games. Next, we come to the scenarios, of which there are 10. The Investigation, the Revenants, the Troll Bridge, Confirmed Kill, Sunken Treasure, the Haunted Ruins, Last Stand, the Loot Guru Surprise, Infested Monastery, and Ship in the Fog. Good range of scenarios. Wide number of monsters and baddies that you have to deal with. And a good number. 10 is a fair number. That's enough scenarios to keep it interesting and to keep it varied as you play through the game or play through your campaign. Now, one thing that is in this one that I don't know if it's in the other books that Joe has written is there's a section for creating your own scenarios. Now, I do know for a fact that Joe McCullough is very, very supportive of fan content. With Rangers, he even went so far as to having like this really nice professional kind of letterhead thing made up for the cover page of fan scenarios. I think it's the Heroes League or Heroes Guild, something along those lines. But it's a really, really nice professional looking template for fans to use. And I love that kind of support from for a game from an author. It makes me so very, 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 very happy. And it gives you, some tips for establishing your story, setting up your table, choosing the monsters, clue markers, the special rules, rewards, and then to just play it, But some tips and pointers for along the way. And then we come into what may be my favorite part, the solo play part of the book. So solo play doesn't differ that much. The core rules of the game, checks, all that stuff stays the same. The big changes are the turn order as well as the fate pool. So the turn order goes player phase 1 where it's half rounded down, then it goes monster, then it goes back to player phase and you finish out your activations. Your fate pool is just 1 skill dice and 1 power dice. No monster dice. Now there are some clues and stuff or events maybe that can give you those things, but they're kind of few and far between. And then it gives you a 4-mission scenario that you can play, starting with the Wolf Pack, then the Ruined Chapel, then the Troll Hunts, and then the Last Mile, and then a Bestiary, so you've got all the cards. Now, I am desperately hoping that Mr. McCullough will write some more solo content for this game. Maybe not to the extent, I would love to see it to the extent that he's created Rangers of Shadowdeep content and Stargrave, stuff like that. But I feel that when the supplements come for this game, it's probably going to be more along the lines of the player versus player, because I think that's kind of how a lot of the Frostgrave supplements as well as the Stargrave supplements are set up. But I would like to see the supplements have a mix of both. Would be good. Now there is a fair amount of fan content and stuff in the Facebook group and stuff. I've seen a fairly large number of files for where people have written content, and I like playing player-made missions. I've had a lot of fun. I've had some really good, intense moments playing those kinds of missions. Now, one thing, I'm almost done here. I'm almost done talking at you. One thing I do want to mention before I forget is that if you're coming to this game from Rangers, be aware that it's the opposite. In this game, the clues that you investigate are the deck of cards, and your event tables are a dice roll. I did that wrong the first couple times I've tried the first solo mission, and then I was like, this just doesn't seem right, and then I realized that's why. Then after your bestiary, we come to our attributes. What all your special rules do and how they affect the game and the board around you. We've got a unit sheet back here that you can print out, make photocopies of. This file is also I got cards. There's a printout of unit cards, of soldier cards in the Facebook group for this game. They're printed out really nice, and I had to resize them just a little bit. They were a little bit long and narrow, so I had to resize them just a little bit to get them to fit into a card sleeve the way I wanted them to. But they work great. And that brings us to the end of our discussion about Joseph A. McCullough's The Silver Bayonet, a war game of Napoleonic Gothic horror that I have already enjoyed a great deal of the games that I've played, and I am very much looking forward to digging into this hard and playing all of the solo games and as many of the other scenarios as I can wrangle people up to play. And I'm looking forward to making as much content out of it as I can. I hope that if you were on the edge about this game, that this video helped you make a decision. I hope that if you already have this game and you're watching this anyways, that I didn't mess anything up too bad. I hope I got most of the things right. I think I did. I've read this a bunch of times. Like I said, I bought this right when it came out last year towards October or so, I think, and have read it numerous times since then. So really excited to get into this one. Thank you so much for stopping by, hanging out today, and letting me talk at you. And as always, I'd like to say a big, huge, from the bottom of my heart, thank you to our patrons who support us and pledge to us over on Patreon. You guys are the absolute best. If you enjoyed the content you saw here today and that's something that you would like to consider doing to help out the channel, go over there, check out the link in the description, check out the Patreon. There's a lot of cool stuff over there, including access to our Discord server, talk to me, hang out with me, talk about our work, what we got going on in the hobby, some shout outs, all kinds of cool stuff. Check it out if that's something that you think you would be into. And regardless of whether or not you do that, I want you to know that I am incredibly grateful that you decided to stop by and spend part of your day with me today, rolling dice and pushing toy soldiers around. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day. And as always, may the dice be ever